Hello everyone, today we talk about the Battle of Riade fought on March the 15th, 933. I could have made the video 3 days ago, it would have been, because you get it even a day later because I recorded, in fact, the day prior. But I just religiously followed the God-given cycle order that therefore owns this fatal meaning behind it all. Riade is in Thuringia. We will talk about the battle location later because we do not know exactly where the battle took place. It seems that Riade was just Henry the Flavor's encampment. Riade is also known, in fact, as the Battle of Merseburg, depending on the historiographical preference. As you know, we already talked about Ottonian warfare to the degree that we know essentially the fundamentals of Eastern Frankish warfare. In the era, the same goes for the Magyars. We talked often about them. I made multiple videos about their arms and armor. We also observed them from Leo the Wise's Tactica, and so the re-edition largely of the older Strategicon Aber chapter. Also because these Asiatic peoples did not really change too much in the military fundamentals. In fact, I made multiple videos putting them relatively together, just observing how the military fundamentals of these peoples remained substantially unchanged throughout the period. They cover, I think, like between 500 and 1000 AD. So with Riade, we are in the same timeline, which, as you know, is unfortunately plagued by a chronic lack of tactical details that, at least to the degree they could offer us a complete picture of the battlefield. We are very well aware of this. We've seen it for Carolingian warfare as well, that is close, in fact, to the Ottonian one. We know that, for example, the only tactically reconstructible battle of the entire Carolingian era is the Battle of Zuntel. That was not just one of the few Carolingian defeats of the period, but also one against the Saxons, right? So the yet to be evangelized people that unironically did rise to the empire. Not quite with Riade, but in a way that was in fact offered to the same Henry that said, to me it's enough to be a king of the Eastern Franks, even though there is all of course, the meaning behind, that is, of course, the Imperium did manifest, but they were talking about properly the Roman Empire, the embarkment into an Italian expedition, etc. His son Otto, after the Battle of Lechfeld, that was yet another major display of Saxon power. Eastern Frankish power at large, of course, Saxonly-led Teutonic power against the Hungars at Lechfeld would open to the properly imperial recognition, also with the Roman crowning later on, etc. This is also the reason, by the way, why we don't have enough evidence to even use a map for this battle. It's important to concentrate thus on certain aspects that are political, strategical, but also anthropological, cultural, because we're looking at a very interesting scenario. The Eastern Franks were one side, the Magyars from the other, thus at a picture of real sort of international affirmation of regional power that would, in fact, be dramatically momentous for the refoundation, for the Renovatio Imperium. So the disposition of Europe as we see it even today, to an extent. I made multiple videos, by the way, explaining the importance of this eastern frontier, the clash between the Franks, the Slavs, the Magyars, and how fundamentally the Ottonians saved the same Eastern Frankish kingdom from a potential destabilization of the same Saxony, Thuringia, and Bavaria that were the most hit territories, that is the most exposed to the Slavo-Magyar invasions. In fact, we should never forget that the Magyars had such an upper hand on Germany at some point, not just because mostly, in fact, some Eastern Frankish princes were trying to escape, in fact, a monarchic power concentration, were simply allowing these marauders to cross the Seine Germany and arriving to plunder up to France, Spain, etc. But because the Slavs that had yet to be fully essentially Christianized and thus stabilized as peoples in friendly terms with the post-Carolingian powers, were routinely following the Magyar raids, and they were stirred by the same hungers against the Germans. Again, lots of videos I dedicated to the topic. There is a medieval Central Europe playlist that deals at large with, say, the entire Middle Ages of the region, but of course a lot about this. I made multiple videos about the Ottonian expeditions to exactly Western Slavic territories, Bohemia. We've seen the Daleminzi, the Obodrites, etc. Also, we talk about Ottonian campaigns in the West against Western Francia, for example, and more. Right. So Riade is an obvious addition. We will talk also about the Lechfeld and other clashes at some point to the pretty interesting and long Ottonian warfare that, for some reason, oddly enough, doesn't make too many views. I mean, every time I talk about, I don't know, Germanic warfare or some other aspects of chivalry, knighthood, more or less around the same era, I may get lots of views, etc. But if it is about the Ottonians, right, in this, say, period that I personally consider incredibly important for the definition of European identity, that is post-Carolingian Europe, this era between the 10th, the 11th century, before the rise of feudal monarchies, so to say, and this relentless military recompaction from seigneurial lordships, from the pretty big and wide and relevant post-Carolingian Europe, is essentially France, Germany, Italy, and so on. I do not get the impression, at least, that the world is particularly even aware of this period as an era on its own, right? There are some eras that are sort of universes in their own kind, and that should attract, in this sense, all some kind of lore, of vibe, etc. This era, I don't think, has ever been particularly popularized, and unfortunately, that may be the cause of this relative neglection. It's fascinating also because we are in between two eras. Consider that the Eastern Franks have just been Christianized. Henry the Fowler was born during the same last Carolingian phase. The Roman connection had just been re-established. The Ottonians themselves will define themselves metaphysically Roman over their own Saxon identity later on. You have this pretty turbulent moment, like in the north of the Seine Germany, with the Vikings from one side, Western Slavs from the other. These Magyars that are veritable foreigners to a big degree, and reinvigorating, re-injecting that steppe sort of migration era vibe that you can't find actually within the Seine Germany. I mean, the Draco standard, for example, that we made a video on for at least Roman times, would not disappear from the German battlefields until the 13th century. There is so much here at play. Also, the local sort of domestic tension between the elites, the populace, the necessity for the affirmation, in fact, of a military backbone that will be necessary to get rid of these Magyars. And then there is all an ideological and propagandistic side of the story that reflects itself in turn on the historiographical production of especially the Ottonian era. That is to say, the relevance of the Battle of Lechfeld having been a bit too magnified by the further successes of Otto I. And it's not to say that Lechfeld was not a big important battle that settled basically the Magyar issue for good, right? Because after that, they basically stopped any raid in the west. They tried against the Byzantines, and then they decided, okay, you know what, guys, we will have to settle down as a monarchy on the western, and specifically like the German model. There's a very beautiful and interesting military history between Hungary and Germany during the High Middle Ages that beyond, in fact, the Magyar invasions is incredibly underrated. This for saying what? That actually Riade, that was less celebrated, actually was a hell of a battle, also a more relevant considering the fact that Henry the Fowler's, as we all understand now, had just risen to a level of power. He had to pay tribute to the Magyars to actually be able to rule in Germany to begin with, to stop temporarily the raids. And when he was confident enough, he stopped paying that, and that's why the Hungars arrived up to Thuringia, or basically Saxony, to settle the matter with him and get defeated. But there are also the unsung heroes of the situations. There are the Bavarians that will not enjoy the same Ottonian political encomium from, in fact, the imperial propaganda later on, even when, as you know, a branch of the Ottonians will start ruling from the same Bavaria. But those guys were the first in line in terms of exposure to the Magyars, and they fought with great impetus as well, thus consistently contributing to the weakening of the Magyars. And in fact, by the time of the Lech, had already, in fact, been softened up enough for Otto I to collect this great victory over them. So it's a very archaic, primitive phase in European history, in Central Europe in particular. You have these Germanic warriors drunk in the same epos that could exist, 300 years before in the same region of military deeds. Think about the Nibelungenlied tradition, this idea of Attila, the Hun, that could easily be seen within the same Magyars later on at the court of, in fact, of Attila in Vienna, that is also close again to the aforementioned Bavarians, and more or less the Magyars are settled in the Pannonian Basin themselves. They even take, as you know, some parts of Germanized territory. So and there is this sense of the impending doom with the relentless erosion of the roots of the world by the primordial snake, and the Asgard being threatened, literally major, even in the mists of eastern Frankish forests. These castles, like very small things, like Mountain Baileys, just really lost into this very primordial, very inhospitable environment that the Germany really was like gazing at these swarms of riders, like plundering around, like the smokes rising up, and like having probably the sense of like this stinky like wood and stone, and barely stone at all at this point, telling you the truth, and mud fortress that had, however, that was truly the Asgard, though. It was truly the pillar of the world and the last bulwark against the gates of hell. And so it also this increasing incipient Christian identity, fully molded now in an equally nascent sense of Teutonic nationality that brings truly, in a moral sense, to the rise of the sacred order of the Ottonian Imperium that is conferred in the typically, in fact, Germanic fashion by the various ethnic duchies, in this case, to the ruler, to the greater warrior, to lead the others to victory in the name of God, blessed by the Holy Ghost. So it's really a world on its own you cannot not love, right? And so this is the picture overall. In the early 10th century, the East Frankish kingdom had been facing this repeated incursions by the Magyars that, as you know, was essentially a nomadic cavalry people from the steppe, the Germans always having historically to cope with these, because regardless of the very poor documentation, in fact, of Central Europe up to just these times, basically, we do know that the relations with the steppe itself, that is just next door, had always been intense. I mean, the same Attila at some point had been ruling over these lands altogether. And unlike conquerors, the Magyars, however, struck swiftly, plundering and burning before vanishing, in many ways showing their actual frailty from a political and strategical point of view, but exploiting marvelously that post-Carolingian fragmentation to arriving to plunder up to literally southern Italy, Burgundy, but mostly preying upon the Eastern Frankish kingdom. It was not the richest, but was the closest. And also one that we illustrated also in different videos, even recently, the political weakness, like all the difficulty that exactly for that lack of surplus, the local monarchy had to even affirm itself. And of course, you know that the Ottonians managed to raise to power exactly as the metus hostilis against the Hungars was rising through these raids. And so we have these in southern Germany that was also a bit more florid, northern Italy even more, and even Lotharingia, and again beyond. The Saxon duchy, spanning modern Lower Saxony, Schleswig-Holstein, I made videos for each of these areas, Saxon-Anhalt, Thuringia, and northern Hesse, was among the regions hit the hardest. And that could have technically been destabilized for good by the Magyars, because they were relatively new districts that in this Germano-Slavic frontier really did not have much cohesion to stand in the first place. Now, these attacks exploited the fragmentation of the Carolingian Empire after Emperor Arnulf of Carinthia's death in 899. Those guys were from the southeast, so they had to cope with the remnants also of the Avars, but more especially the arrival of the Magyars that had really, again, halted and even reverted the Ostsiedlung in the area. I made a video about Carinthia just a couple of months ago. If you're interested, you can check that out. Leading thus, because those were also the militarized markets that had to halt any kind of invasion, East Francia, altogether vulnerable as its stem duchies Saxony, Bavaria, Swabia, Franconia, operated with significant autonomy, often prioritizing local power over collective defense. It's a sort of mob racket, right? You have the Magyars arriving saying, if you don't let us pass, we plunder here, or simply plundering there, if they could. And then in exchange, like the local Frankish lord would pay something, a sort of tribute, that in turn maybe even helped him gaining more control on the local populace that was both more dependent on this guy, but also poorer, right? As he was the only one that in this emergential situation could further militarize his own power, entrenching his seigneurial prerogatives there. And so things had been going like this on for a while. Henry I, elected king in 919, I made multiple videos about the rise of Henry the Fowler, so if you're interested in that, you know where to search, inherited this disjointed realm and its Magyar problem. In 926, near the royal palace of Werla, his forces captured an unnamed Magyar prince, leveraging this to negotiate a 9-year truce. The cost was a yearly tribute, as we said before, a bitter pill that, however, bought precious time for especially the Saxon duchy, increasingly more stiffened by the relentless Ottonian work in the Ludolfing, because that was the actual name of the dynasty at the point. Ottonian would become later. Castle building, like military organization, like land clearance, deforestation, agricultural development in this very tough, lands, cold, primitive, brutal. The Saxons were sort of this bloodiest heirs to the same warriors of the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in spirit, in temper. So there was a great military potential that could be unlocked after the Carolingian conquest of these peoples that took really decades to bring down and were brought down, but also transfigured, right, redeemed into the evangelization, the elevation, in fact, at this point, to that sap of Western sort of enlightened elite and dispossessed people combination that are given a new chance to redeem the whole system, not just themselves, into a great military conquest. This is Western history in a nutshell. Henry used the aforementioned respite strategically. He enacted a military reform, we can't so call it, its details of course being murky, but likely focused on building a mobile cavalry-based force, which was becoming really the thing in 10th century Europe. The military class, what we call the milites, the knights, are properly born at this point as an establishment. Of course, that existed since Indo-European times, but in the sort of more vassalitic beneficiary and later feudal sense of the same, that the idea that there is just one guy that controls most of the wealth, for which accordingly most people work just for him to be constantly trained as a heavily armored warrior on horseback that fights, by the way, together with the others, so gaining a major collective training and capacity, is born at this time in the post-Carolingian world. And bear in mind that in Saxony, the surplus was even scarcer than in the rest of Germany. So in order to mold this force, it took even greater efforts. And this tells you about the Saxon result that had already been displayed against Charlemagne. But this was a whole mechanism entailing also, for example, the erection of new fortifications, the resumption of campaigns against the more troublesome enemies, for example, the 906 one against the Slavic tribes east of the Elbe and the Saale, that witnessed the subjugation of the Obodrites, the Wilzes, the Hevellers, the Daleminzi, the Bohemians, the Red Aris. Some of these people literally disappeared from the political map of Europe, because largely also of the Saxons and the Ostsiedlung, others, as the Bohemians, acquired much higher status, as you know. But it's always the same frontier. It is ethnically redrawn, even with an important degree of organization and rationalization. But again, from this background, it was always based on conflict, on antagonism, on competition. And by the way, even though we know less about these places, and technically, like we could make the case, of course, there were other areas of post-Carolingian Europe that were also militarily active and or also didn't need this enormous effort to be effective, even though this was a tough time for everybody involved, like between the Magyars, the Vikings, the Saracens, pretty nasty things were going on. But as always, a bit like the way we just described for East Francia, they happened because the local establishment sort of allowed it to some degree, as there were other things to settle first. And yet, these are, especially again in Northeastern Europe, these are some of the individually, in relative terms, some of the most traumatically violent pages in the entire history of Europe, and they led to the brutal subjugation of these Slavs to the Eastern Frankish kingdom. Similar things had been happening since even Merovingian times, not even the Carolingian ones. But at this point, especially these protagonists of the Eastern Frankish kingdom that are located now on the veritably eastern frontier are trying to make a much greater effort to make things go their way. And the Battle of Riade at large is the same with the Magyars as well. The instrumental relation with the Slavs we already hinted at. Now, politically, Henry the Fowler adopted a shrewd, restrained approach, granting the stem dukes considerable independence to secure their loyalty, a move that bolstered his authority without sparking rebellion. He couldn't and wouldn't attempt to simply subjugate them, to wage war in their lands, because the same Saxony needed to grow before accomplishing that. As we were saying before, the German landscape at this point was still very savage, right? There were massive forests, some of which actually exist still today, but at the time were much bigger and also much more imposing just to the technological and energetic means of the time to literally draw this political geography of the various stem duchies. There were some parts impenetrable. It was also full of swamps. The major what communications could be at that point. So it was actually a relentless work of colonization, but again, one that could just follow a certain pace, given, in fact, the same local resources. But this work was enough for Henry the Fowler to rise to that level of national and eventually international power. In fact, by 932, his preparations were complete. When a Magyar delegation arrived to collect the tribute, he reportedly flung a dead dog at their feet, a humiliating rejection that ended the truce and signaled defiance. This provocation was deliberate. Henry had spent the peace strengthening East Francia to confront the Magyars head-on, aiming to end their extortion and unify his fractious nobles against a common enemy. By the way, the dead dog symbolism is not random, right? For a couple of reasons. First of all, the meaning of the wolf is one of follower, right? It's the low-rank warrior of the Gefolgschaft. We talked extensively about Germanic warfare, and in many ways what you see for the migration era is still true here. It's a much more aristocratic system, it's much more elitary, but especially in eras like Saxony, and we've seen it from the Elia and more, like there was this ferocious, bloodthirsty mentality and not much this veritable excitement, inebriation for bloodshed and war, because this hematophilia, as you know well from Merovingian times and previous ones, was all one with self-sacrifice, but also the sacrifice of the enemy in holy combat, etc. And giving someone, essentially like equating him to a dog and to a dead one, of course, meant that he was good for nothing. He was just in the lowest rank of international relations, that these Magyars were just a bunch of martyrs worth nothing. Plus, the steppes peoples had strong connections with the wolf, two levels of, in some cases, there was some level of shamanism that was not really considered more than much by the elites, but practice like, I don't know, warriors that owled to the moon at night. There is something like this for the Kumans at some point in later military history. And so the idea from a German perspective, especially that all these eastern steppes peoples were something lowly, barbaric, and scummy of some sort, was exactly here expressed in Henry's gesture toward the Magyars. Right, you're essentially lesser people. We are the chosen ones, God's master race, and now we'll show you what that really means. And so this is how the campaign of Riade started. The Magyars invaded in 933, likely splitting into multiple raiding parties, as they were used to fight. Again, we've seen this well in the tactic of Leoderwise, but also Western sources. This is how, for example, the Hungarians kept fighting for a consistent while. The idea that we explained many times is that actually these horse archers, I think these steppes peoples, are not really that terrible, uncatchable, sort of unassailable or undefeatable thing that we tend to imagine them, like maybe because of some Vietnam War syndrome still to be healed from. These are actually the weaker side. Of course, at large by scale, if there is, like in this case, a force invading, and it is of the same provincial, regional, whatever you want to call it, substance, like you have to be careful. You must defeat them in some way, because if you give them something. If you make a mistake, you can easily be overrun by them as well. But at large, right, the notion that there is a core of more heavily armored steppe warriors that represents the elite, right? But from in fact, an autocratic background that is typical of the steppes themselves. The Magyars originated from the forest, but eventually had been injected into the steppes as Ugrafins. They had actually a very weak popular cohesion. I mean, at least they can stick together as long as there is some raiding to do, and the filing rank horsemen that will not even necessarily fight with that order is a missile element, right? So Western armies at this point are already stronger. After all, the Magyars were independently defeated even before this point by, for example, the Southern Longobards, the Burgundians. At some point, right, they had, especially as they were retreating, this is typical, like they were ambushed, right? This is just like, I don't know, the defense in depth, even the Romans against the barbarians tended to do this. They actually let them plunder to even subjugate better the population. We've seen it before. It was happening within the same East Francia. And then actually attacking the enemy when they were loaded in loot that could also maybe take for themselves as noblemen, to reinvest as they saw it fit, to say the least, and destroying them. Of course, any major attempt to defeat these guys had overall failed, so those were secondary clashes. This one at Riade is big enough. It's not going eventually in the outcome to end the Magyar raids in Germany, but it is a very clear message to the entire Hungar establishment that things have changed and they're essentially not going to ever be the same. The Magyars really lived off of these predations. They were still semi-nomadic in lifestyle, and they exploited very cleverly, by the way, the political division that was going on after the end of the Carolingian Empire in the West. And so there was the center of, in general, like this is as a scheme at large, like the center of precious elite forces, and then you have sometimes even 30 kilometers away, so literally a day's march or even less, different parties that work as some sort of as raiders that tell you where the heavier Western force is, because if that comes to grip without warning with the core of your forces in the rear, the entire army can be wiped out. And also these lighter troops that constitute these parties raid and plunder in the meanwhile. And they also have to do so by allowing the passage of the army to forage. And so it's a complex thing. We'll come back talking about Magyar warfare in depth because it's very, very interesting. And as we will learn now from the sources that we will present in a while, we know a few, but one of the things is that one raiding party of the Magyars besieged a town, possibly near Merseburg. Again, this is also sometimes the name of the battle, besides Riade. In any case, we are in those places. By the way, Merseburg is truly the core here of Saxon power. So that is concentrated in the northeast angle of Saxon, with Magdeburg as well on the Elbe, right? So to facilitate, even just operationally, strategically, that attack against the Slavs we've seen before. So Thuringia is just across. And I also made a video about medieval Thuringia that shows you how sort of relatively weak as a stem duchy it was, also in terms of territorial definition, because essentially since Frankish times had been bullied into subjection by both the Franks and especially the Saxons, that initially they joined forces to weaken this people of the Thuringi that I also made a video on. In any case, other raiding parties were venturing elsewhere. The Magyar army relied on light cavalry and skilled archers, as we pointed out, mostly by numbers. Then, of course, there was a tough core behind everything, employing, however, at large, as you understand, a hit-and-run tactic akin to the same, I don't know, think about the Parthians in antiquity, right? They're the same kind of mold. Charging in small groups, unleashing deadly volleys, and retreating swiftly, alternating this, essentially unnerving rather than physically damaging the enemy. And as we know from von Clausewitz, war is primarily a matter of moral forces, so that from the other side, you never know whence the last swarm of these lighter troops that will literally not allow you to lower your guard and will wear you out over time with minimal, say, at least offense from their side, even though they would actually tire themselves down because they were constantly doing back and forth. So actually from the other side, that's the point. They were actually the weaker side. But at some point, like if, the enemy was softened up enough, the Magyar elite would intervene as a reserve, as a last resort, and try to break through, and sometimes it would really happen. Then, of course, there was a lot of siege warfare going on. The same Magyar elite would dismount, would assault the fortifications, etc. But at large, the main objective was passing through, plundering, and the same defenders would, for that reason, like being more developed than these nomadic societies, prefer to save their skins and having salvaged something like chattel and agricultural surplus, etc., into the seigneurial reserves in the castles, in these walled spaces, together with the populace, and waiting for these guys to go away. This is true in part also for the Vikings, for the Saracens. What is interesting is that all the all the post-Carolingian kingdoms were ravaged by all three of these people. Like the Saracens even arrived in Germany, in the Upper Rhine Valley at some point, passing from Fraxinetum to the Eastern Frankish kingdom. And so these are tough times. They're a bit like the peak of these attacks. The Magyars had previously overwhelmed Western forces, including Henry's own defeat in 924. So there was nothing really to kid with these guys about. Now, Henry marshaled a mixed force, including the Heerband, so the levied militia from Saxony and Thuringia. The Heerband was the historical militia levy of able-bodied freemen. In theory, like, everybody should have fought in case of emergency, and people would remain in arms, they would defend their farms, etc. But of course, just a small part of the entire able sort of male population, because even some serfs would be mobilized. At some point, there is all the issue of the ministeriales, the milites agraria. I'm not going to talk about this because I made an entire video about the Ottonian army organization that you can check out. In Germany, individual liberty is very blurred, right? This is turning fast into something very, very privatistic, to say the least. There's a very scarce public authority, but the only one that exists, in fact, passes through this military means. So there was a rota system, of course, since ever. There were some classes of recruitment based on wealth. Again, the more affluent guys were literally the milites. The lower ones just were archers, basically, on foot. And the public authority was here, like the Duke of Saxony, as far as Saxony was concerned, but in this case with Henry as Eastern Frankish king, right? So he could, as you see here, muster forces from both Saxony and Thuringia in virtue of that. As we were recalling before, the battle's exact location remains elusive for obvious reasons. It's tied to, we do not know enough, topographically speaking, and just from the sources. It's tied to a mysterious castle of Wido and sought in the Helme Unstrut lowlands or near Merseburg. Scholars propose various sites. Some suggest Riade, that would have been in fact Henry's camp, which is not even a place, or at least that we know of today. It was essentially close to Ritterburg, where the Helme meets the Unstrut. The only reason, which may be even a correct one, for which we think that this was the actual Riade, is that there are historical references in loco to rout or Riade, so that may have been actually. Some other scholars instead argued for Radevel as Riade, near the Elster-Saale confluence, though this ignores, for example, some doubts about a Merseburg locale. Others point to Rittgen, near Weißensee, citing field names like Hunnenfeld. So this would have been linked to the Magyars in folklore, because as we explained, the Magyars, the Huns, basically the same thing in German eyes. In a command post at Kainz or Königsberg, of course there are many, not that Königsberg, it was not even founded, at least with that name at the time. No consensus exists, but the Unstrut region near Merseburg aligns with Widukind of Corvey's account. So here we start getting into the sources, because we will read them. Essentially, we have just a couple of illustrious sources. I already talked about them, in fact, in different videos, just per se, because they are the basis for our Ottonian historical understanding at large. Widukind of Corvey and Liutprand of Cremona. So Widukind, born roughly around 925 and died after 973, was a Saxon monk and historian at the Benedictine monastery of Corvey in Westphalia. Little is known of his personal life, but he emerged as a key chronicler of the Ottonian dynasty with his Res Geste Saxonice, so the deeds of the Saxons, written in the 60s of the 10th century, and dedicated to Mathilda, daughter of Otto I. This 3-volume work chronicles Saxon history from their origins to the reign of Otto I, Henry I's son, blending oral traditions, monastic records, and contemporary accounts. Widukind's perspective is distinctly Saxon, celebrating Henry I, also in fact a Saxon, and being in fact a bit against the later Ottonian narrative that these were Romans now, as opposed to Saxons, together with their empire. And so Henry the Fabler in general cannot but be in Widukind's work the foundational figure who strengthened the realm against external threats like the Magyars. By the way, all the great German royal houses at this point are essentially founded by a father that builds castles like crazy and leaves to his son like a very important asset for military expansion. Castles, as we've seen, equates also to knights, etc. Think about the father of Frederick Barbarossa, Frederick II of Swabia, because that was the name of his father. The same goes for others. It's just like Philip II and Alexander III of Macedon, to draw, of course, parallelisms between illustrious figures. Now, Widukind's account of the Battle of Riade is a primary source offering tactical details, in fact, just together with Liutprand, that are useful, right, for us to understand many aspects of the battle. As we will see now, for example, Henry's use of lightly armed troops to lure the Magyars, so de facto acting a bit like them, and emphasizing its political significance, though his writings reflect a bias towards glorifying Saxon leadership, and again, it's fine. We always say that I do not know what you think about history, but it's completely normal for this to be the case, and we know that, right? So there's this giant pseudo-historical conspiracy by which, history is a mega scam by everybody who wrote, because for some reason, and just, however, the ones that are antipathetic to you, because the others are okay instead. Again, the mentally feeble always need this kind of weird self-reassurance and, of course, delving in paranoia. And we will leave them to their lesser people's mental illness, but we don't care. Now, as a near contemporary, writing decades after the event, Widukind's reliability stems from access to living memory, of course, and official narratives. Think at the Saxon court, I mean, there would have been an official narrative, plus, of course, people who had fought in battle. Of course, some details may be stylized for effect, but again, we understand that. Then Liutprand of Cremona, born around 920, died in 972, was an Italian cleric, a diplomat, and historian from Pavia, the capital of the Kingdom of Italy, that was, as you know, reacquired by the Ottonians as Holy Roman Emperors. Considered like these guys' time span, right? They had the full, like these were born into a time in which basically various Italic rulers claimed the imperial title for themselves. They lived up to see literally the Holy Roman Empire, say in that historiographical sense, fully fledged with this reconnection of essentially the German-Italian axis plus Burgundy and more. Born into a prominent Longobarд family, Liutprand served as a diacon and chancellor under Italian kings before entering the court of Otto I, that had actually offered him refuge as he was being persecuted by local rulers. We are in the 50s of the 10th century. So Liutprand goes over to Germany, and then he comes back to Italy together with Otto, and in fact that would conquer the kingdom. And that's the moment where Liutprand becomes Bishop of Cremona. That's why we call him Liutprand of Cremona. In 961, this is all the face of the bishop. Counts made lots of videos on this. I made a video about medieval Cremona if you're interested. So these are, again, incredibly important sources, not just, by the way, for German history. In fact, his works, including Antipodesis, which is the one that contains the account about Riade. Antipodesis means retribution, written between 958 and 962, recount events across Europe, often with a sharp satirical edge. Liutprand's account of Riade appears in this text, reflecting his broader aim to narrate the struggles between East Francia and its foes, including the Magyars. Unlike Widukind, Liutprand was not Saxon, but an outsider with ties to Otto's regime, as we've seen, given his perspective a more pan-European flavor. Right, in his work, for example, the legation to Constantinople, where he went over on behalf of Otto the Great as literally like imperial ambassador to the Byzantines, there is a beautiful passage in which Liutprand literally states that he's a German, even though this was, again, an Italian, and he surely had a Germanic ancestry, etc. But to him, like the fact that this your Latin Germanic world was really affirmed in the sense that he says, like, we are the Saxons, the Longobards, the Burgundians, etc., like against the Romans, intended in a pejorative sense when talking about the Byzantines. Liutprand was very also biased politically speaking, because he was writing specifically also an sometimes also an anti-papal, at least he was not for the institution itself, but justifying the Ottonian, say, reform, in other words, manipulation of papal appointments, etc., just look with the bishops on the dioceses, as we've seen, that would paradoxically would found the premises for the St. Gregorian reforms against the empire later. But this is for other videos that we already made. We do not need to waste time now. Now, his description of the Magyar's Celtic flight and Riade aligns with Widukind's, though his flair for dramatic storytelling describing a headless flight adds color. Writing later than Widukind and with a career shaped by Otto I's patronage, Liutprand's reliability is tempered by his tendency again to embellish for rhetorical impact, but his diplomatic experience lends credence to his grasp of political stakes. Made lots of videos about Ottonian Italy. We will come back talking about that, and also the previous era in Liutprand's youth, because this is obviously a pan-European deal. So let's simply read, as we always do for our tactical reconstruction videos, these accounts from the respective authors, because they are really the only thing we have about the battle. As you know, I am a PhD in medieval history. I specialize in particular in battle reconstruction. Were I to write something more consistent on Riade, of course I wouldn't use my YouTube video for doing so. But let's say the first thing that, of course, you must unavoidably pass through, even before scholarship, is actually all the battle accounts that we have. Then, of course, coupling that with scholarship, but also with, a good relief terrain satellite image. Better if you're properly going on the battlefield. Here we don't even know where it took place, so the accounts are ever more important in relative terms. But again, it's first and foremost, in fact, the documentary sources. There is no military history without documentary sources. Military history cannot be made with archaeology, cannot be made with wishful thinking, with obscure archive sources. That can help. But without the chronicles, you go no freaking where. Without narrative sources, zero. All right? Now, here it's, this is book 1 of Widukind Res Gest Saxonische, book 1, chapter 38. That passes straight from matters from, relation with Duke, Conrad, etc., to the battle. I mean, Luthbrand of Cremona is actually a better source, but this is a moment of glory, and Widukind really speaks very interestingly of this. The king's speech and how he defeated the Hungarians in an open battle. Now, that the king had a military force was proven in mounted combat. He decided to fight against the ancient foe, namely the Hungarians. So he summoned the entire people and addressed them with the following oration. Once your empire was disrupted on every side by countless dangers, but now it is free. You yourselves know this well, having labored under the grinding weight of civil conflicts and foreign wars, and now, through the grace of the highest divinity, by our own labor and by your strength, there is peace and unity. The barbarians have been defeated and subjected in service to us. There is just one thing remained for us to do. We must also join together against our common enemy, the Avars. This is very interesting because these weren't the Avars, but you see, this is not just a Byzantine influence in part of sort of classical ethnography from mostly like a Germanic migration era perspective, rather, but it's definitely an interesting remark. In fact, that common enemy, like it's already that he doesn't call them the Huns, right? But there is a continuity with that regional basin of nomads, right, from the Pannonian plain. I have so the barbarians he's talking about before are the Slavs, right? So here the Magyars, of course, are considered superior to the Slavs. That's also the German perspective about the story. Again, made plenty of videos. I know that it's funny to crack jokes into this stuff and comment it, but we're also trying to make it serious enough. And here you see that there is a period, of course, of internal clashes between the Eastern Franks. Before I made it simple, but of course there were lots of sort of rebellions, issues, campaigns. This is what all, say, the Frankish Carolingian system had been engineering since ever. So of course also the Eastern Frankish elites fight in this fashion. Here Widukind wants to present the thing as if the entire Frankish, say the Eastern Franks, participated as a people, but of course it is meant in that already sort of aristocratic and now really elite oligarchic sense of the Ottonian establishment. In any case, he says, I have plundered you, your sons and your daughters, to fill their treasuries. The reference here is to the treasuries of the Hungarians and the fact that, again, he had to pay a tribute that now he had stopped paying. That's the reason why, again, the Magyars had immediately come to knock at the door to get hash money. And now I'm forced to plunder the churches and the servants of those churches living as naked and with no money. This is for the same reason. Consider among yourselves what should be done about this, and choose. Should I take the treasures that were consecrated to the divine office and hand them over to purchase our redemption from the enemies of God? This is actually an incredibly contemporarily relevant statement, right? What kind of peace do you want to buy? One by paying your own enemies off? Like, it doesn't sound a very intelligent thing to do in the first place. For a while, for some purposes, just like Henry did here, can last. But then you have to break their fucking face. At this, the people, and this is of course why Widukind rhetorically rocks, right? And so this, the people raised their voices to heaven, saying that they wished above all to be redeemed by the living and true God, because he was faithful and just in all of his paths and holy in all of his works. Of course, consider what this means, right? If you pay tribute to someone, basically you're bestowing part of the imperium to them, so they are actually the media to God for your own rule. This is incredibly insulting, right? And so here these people raise their voices to heaven. It's the sense of like the chance for redemption, the sense of being able to emerge or vindicating this previous sins. He was talking about promising to the king their full effort against this most vicious of peoples. They raised their right hands into the air and affirmed this pact. So they swore in front of God and he's and their leader, and in fact God's sent leader. After he made this agreement with the entire people, again Widukind stresses this aspect to understand the political cohesion of the kingdom, right? Under the Ottonians, the king dismissed the assembled multitude. This is the typical display of the exercitus in arms, right? The assembly of free people that in arms confer the imperium, or at least decide to follow the guy that is provided by God with the imperium by lending their arms to him, and also for a specifically military purpose, just like in Tacitus' Germania. After these events, the Hungarian legates came to the king to receive their customary gifts, but they departed from him to return to their own land empty-handed. When they heard this, the Avars did not delay. They hurried to enter Saxony with a large hostile force. They took the route through Daleminzia, so this, again, the aforementioned Slavic territory, and sought help from their old friends. But the Daleminzi, known that the Hungarians were hurrying to Saxony and that the Saxons were ready to fight them, gave a very fat dog to the Hungarians as their gift. The Hungarians did not have time to avenge this insult, as they were hurrying on to a different fight, as we've seen, basically the Slavs. Because the Slavs were not happy at all that the Magyars manipulated them for their shady purposes. But of course, they exploited the occasion, at least to plunder a bit of German territory every once in a while. And they were, however, hoping to break free. And actually, their elites looked upon the Eastern Franks as the much more viably sort of imitatable model of establishment than, of course, the more brutal and savage Magyar one. Was much more strongly autocratic and, vicious, as Widukind says. And so, by the way, why the fat dog here? It's like showing them, like, you're maybe now fat because you've eaten too much or something like that, or maybe just because the Slavs considered the Magyars a tiny bit more than Henry the Fowler did. In any case, for quite a while, the Daleminzi pursued their friends while mocking them. This is also funny, because they literally followed them, and you can imagine, of course, if the Magyars had entered their territory, these Slavic forces would just control the paths. They would sort of escort them, but putting pressure and trying to avoid them plundering their own territory. So you see behind these rhetorical issues that are not even that rhetorical, because we can imagine the Slavs to have done exactly this. There is, however, a broader military logic. When the Hungarians crossed the Thuringian frontier with their surprise attack, they raided throughout the land. They then divided their forces, with some heading west and others seeking to enter Saxony from the east and the south. But the Saxons, together with the Thuringians, gathered to fight them. They killed the leaders of the Hungarians and scattered the survivors of this western army. Right here, the reference is to the Hungarian column that advanced west. Right, so this is another. This is a mini battle that happened in parallel with Riade. This was essentially the Heerban of Saxony and Thuringia. Some scholars want to, they placed this clash at Sondershausen, right, while Henry encountered this other, and we'll see also with Liutprand better the entire picture. But it's interesting because, again, this was really the Magyar modus operandi that we explained before. Some, continuing with Widukind, were overwhelmed by hunger. Others were destroyed by the cold. Still others were killed or captured. As was fitting for such men, they died miserably. The army that had remained in the east learned that a sister of the king lived in a nearby stronghold and had a great deal of gold and silver. By the way, if you study, as we've seen in videos about medieval Hungary, what happened, in 12th century Hungarian legislation, there are laws like, if you kidnap a woman, you have to come back to her parents and, marry her, because this normally happened in Hungary. We know that it happened also, among the Western Slavs, but this is an old thing. If there's a beautiful lady in a tower that is also full of gold, etc., just let's go see what we can do here. And so the site of this fortification, by the way, has not been identified, although Jäckerburg in the modern city of Sondershausen, in fact, about 50 kilometers north of Erfurt, was suggested scholarly as a possible location. She had, so the sister of Henry, had married Vida, the Thuringian, because she had been born to a concubine. Right, Widukind is explaining why King Henry's unnamed sister was married to someone who was not of the highest nobility, because she was just a illegitimate daughter. So they began to attack this fortress with such a large force that they would have captured it if the night had not impeded their vision. But that very night, the Hungarians learned of the defeat of their comrades, the Western army, and that the king was coming against them with a powerful army. The king, of course, is Henry. For the king had established his camp near a place called Riade. Here we get the name. All right, so we've seen there are different opinions. Like Liutprand places the Battle of Riade about 80 kilometers further east compared to, again, the Helme river, like near Kalbsried, right? Because these were the scholarly, and it's from him, in fact, that we get the notion of Merseburg on the east bank of the Saale river as the possible place. So that's the point. We do not know where, but the two sites we discussed before stem respectively from Widukind and Liutprand. We'll read Liutprand later, of course. Overcome by fear, the Hungarians abandoned their camp and, in their customary manner, gathered together their scattered forces with fire and giant smoke signals. The next day, the king brought up his army and exhorted the men to commit their hopes to divine mercy, and not to doubt that divine aid would be there for them, as it had been in all their other battles. The Hungarians were the common enemy of all of them, and they should focus their thoughts on protecting their fatherland and their families. They would soon see that the enemy would flee if they stood firmly in battle. The soldiers were emboldened by this rousing oration. Then the men in the first rank, then in the second, and then in the last, saw the emperor, and an angel flying before him. Do you know what this is? This is Victoria. This is, of course, the universal symbolism since ever. You find in all antiquity, among the Germans, the Romans, the Greeks, there is the chariot of victory that is, run by the warrior, but the path is opened by Victoria, the winged glory, the Holy Ghost. And so the fact that Widukind of Corbeil in the 10th century from Saxon would point this out is something so beautiful, right? It want to make you kill thousands of enemies in front of you. And of course, and some scholars went on saying that this was specifically the Archangel Michael. There would be, in fact, different identifications, also with, of course, the biblical overlapping with the symbology. You know that Saint Michael was particularly appreciated by the Longobards, by the Normans. So the Ottonians would have not really been that different. This angelic symbology was an old thing, also apparently injected by the Gepids as well, from the East German, from the steppes. In fact, the Irano-Germanic culture, let's put it in this way, was very prominent also in Justinian times. That's why I was saying before, like, there is strong migration Iraitas. But again, the symbolism of the angel flying before the leader is something specifically to be found millennia before Christ. And it's, of course, part of the same Catholic tradition, right? And I will make more and more videos about this. All the Indo-European ones talk about this. The history of religions is all about this. And this is so beautiful because you see, when you say, but did tradition really exist? Did you really believe in that? I mean, it literally says that. How can't you see that? Like, you see, even to a scholarly, there are people who literally curate these editions of the text and literally do not know the entire picture. Imagine you're just a philologist or a historian of literature, a historiographer of some sort. If you have never studied history of religions, and if you really never connected the dots, you wouldn't even know. And if you were asked, you wouldn't even know what to say. But it's always been there, right? And you can't deny it. You can't unsee it, especially when it's literally explicit, like in this case. Now, for the large banner was marked with the angel's name and image as well. So they literally used the banner of the same because it would precede the leader, and that's so literally the Holy Ghost. They took great comfort and resolve from this as well. So they knew what that was, right? Widukind states that they collectively knew what that meaning was, right? The king feared, correctly as it turned out, that once the enemy saw his heavily armed soldiers, they would immediately flee. So he deployed a unit of lightly armed Thuringians along with a small number of heavily armed soldiers so that the enemy would pursue the former and thus be led to the main force of the army. This was done, but the Hungarians still fled when they caught sight of the heavily armed main force. They fled for 8 miles, but very few of them were killed or captured. There are minor sources. There is Flodoard, for example, but they do not provide with de facto tactical insight. For example, the Annales Corbienses from Corbie, in fact, at the year 933, claimed that Henry destroyed the Hungarian army properly. Right? So here, again, we will eventually explain what happened for what we understand. But here it's interesting that Widukind, maybe because he wanted to glorify Otto more in his own time than his father, there's this suspicion, right? It says, well, yes, it was a great victory. It was all under the auspices of the Holy Ghost. You've seen how this is also typical of medieval chronicles, especially the ones written by the clergy, that they spend a lot of time talking about, here beautifully actually, about a traditional symbolism. It doesn't quite often happen just per se, especially in such, from archaic times, you can understand more why this is the case. But you see here the speeches, that was also a way for the author to boast his rhetorical skills and sort of but it's very important because these were the political voices of the time. So saying, why are we fighting to begin with, right? Here it's showing the greatness of the leader. Also from a rhetorical point of view, he was a visats, right? A wise that transformed literally like his vision into reality, right? Then, however, their camp was captured and all the captives were set free. This is important because the Magyars would, again, have this sort of fortified rings like the Avars, the Huns, but also the Vikings, by the way, where they stored all the loot. They didn't really have cities as we intend them. And, of course, here on the march, they had all the loot with them, so this is typical. But as you have noticed, of course, the most important tactical information is basically all what we know about the battle at large, is this ruse that I found also in other battles, including my early 14th century ones, that is actually a pretty clever one. And when you study it from also more complex sources and evidence at large in general, you do not immediately understand why this should have worked or not, right? Here we're actually told yet another important thing I didn't stop on before. The presence of 3 distinct battle lines, right? If you remember before, he said that these words were heard from Henry by all the 3 lines, right? And this suggests a deployment in depth that would have been most appropriate for cavalry battles, because essentially you had to channel that subsequent release of tactical reserves into the fray, showing also that the Saxons were wary of the other aka Magyar tricks. This is a very interesting one, and on top of this you have this apparent extra layer, so a 4th battle line that is actually a lighter one in front, like a sort of vanguard, but it's different from a vanguard. It's actually a bait in a way that here Widukind is not explicit about, but that I bet on because I've seen it too often not to recognize it. In fact, there is even a detail that he provides here regarding its constitution. First of all, it says these were lightly armed Thuringians. It's appropriate enough from a political point of view because of the subordinated position of the Thuringians to the Saxons. And so the fact that we're generally poorer and lighter, let's say. But here it says, along with a small number of heavily armed soldiers. So what does this mean? It means that basically he wanted to make this battle line look as a real one, right? I will not say which battle, because otherwise you will recognize me, because I'm the only one to write about this. But in my examples, I found literally entire battle lines that were essentially camouflaged as real ones, although composed by squires. And these were people who had themselves killed, literally, to essentially lure the enemy into an ambush by essentially letting them presume that they had destroyed an entire enemy battle line, a heavy one. So naturally, it was difficult to fool the enemy in a way, but the fact that here the Saxons, for example, could spend this amount of troops and that they would try to have not just light forces just to skirmish with the Magyars, say, but literally having a line of lighter Thuringians, but with still heavily armed soldiers into it, would give the impression to the Magyars that they had accomplished something. Here, we do not have essentially particular numbers. We will talk about that later, but you understand this was probably a clash in the tens of thousands. So these battle lines would have counted thousands of men, and at large, seeing all these guys fleeing at a point would have been likely, a big deal, right? So that would spirit the enemy. Also consider that, especially in these deployments in depth, you do not really know how consistent the enemy army is, especially if there is this weird ballet that we have seen, is especially done by everybody here, telling the truth, in sort of remaining a bit separated, detached from the enemy, so that you can have spies, explorers, etc., turncoats, etc. But revealing essentially the full size of your force, where it is deployed, etc. But these are voices, right? The enemy knows you're there. There are many signals that a big army is on the move from months before. Like, you don't really have to doubt very much. But the details in battle, like the exact numbers, the exact disposition, even the exact number of battle lines, is unknown until you actually find themselves in front of you. So if you see as a Magyar this first line that arrives and is basically defeated, just for them to believe that they were chasing like a substantial part of the enemy army. Maybe they had even broken its bulk, or at least they had scored such unforeseen, or at least feared results from the Saxon side. Well, you could be too galvanized and in fact falling into the trap. Right, this in many ways was actually a same Magyar tactic that probably they didn't think the Saxons could replicate on their own. But again, these Eastern Franks have seen lots of steppe people before. They know how it works. And here we see, by the way, how skilled Henry really is, because you have to devise this battle plan, you have to choose the right man, you have to be very good with timing, with coordination, with command control. This is very difficult for a 10th century army in Central Europe. And yet, the Saxons succeed. These are some sort of even basic tactics that are repeated all over again throughout the millennia. They really never end, right? But they don't, because there is always this level of uncertainty whereby you may have literally tricked the enemy into thinking that you're weaker than you actually are. And so at that point, you will achieve that surprise that is necessary to overwhelm them. It's not the first time we've seen how a certain battle line would essentially get themselves slaughtered to prevent another from being overwhelmed. This is literally not what happened here, not what normally happened. I mean, this battle line, for example, here would have been composed by some apparently weaker elements, but also some good guys, like some sort of paladins, champions that were chosen exactly to be that motivated to literally go quasi-suicidal in order to lure the enemy into this trap. Of course, the battle line, in order to be believed to be a fully fledged one as such by the Magyars, would have been big and offensive, say capable enough to perform its duty, but at large it would have been lighter. And so the ambiguity laying mostly in, is this sort of the best band they have, or what kind of force? I mean, it's big enough for us to cheer for having defeated it, and let's also pursue it, because that was the problem of the Magyars, that they didn't have the same collective training of the Frankish cavalry. As we've seen, they were mostly lighter troops, so they didn't have that battle line cohesion after they had especially started chasing the enemy. This was actually true for spent battle lines, but the Magyars were more eager to plunder. They would be more unruly. Think about, I don't know, these Eastern cavalries. Think about Fort Novo, the Stradiotti that the Albanian mercenaries in Venetian employed, that sort of fucked it all up because they preferred to plunder the French camp rather than finishing the French forces off. It's always a bit like this similar thing. You understand immediately from this how much can go differently from planned. And that's why you have to be good. Even when, this is the point, like the simplest things in war are the most difficult. So this requires an incredible command, a lot of luck, very strong moral forces. Here, everything worked, right? And so that Holy Ghost, the Saint Michael, that victory banner really helped, apparently, all right? So this is the picture, and again, we can imagine that we don't know too much about the rest of the battle. You see, if this had been fought, say, by comparative scale in the 14th century, we would just know so much about what most of the battle lines would have done, how the clash unfolded. Here, it seems Like, we do not know. It's possible that if this was a fourth extra line. So this actually entails a level of tactical complexity which is compatible with, in fact, a much more bitterly fought battle later on. We do not know here about the Magyar array, but we can even think that, of course, because here we don't even know the spaces, the timings. Battlefields could stretch for kilometers. Here we literally do not know anything about the battlefield. We do not know whether, for example, the Magyars were met in a comparable array in depth or something more scattered. In that sense, it's possible that in-depth formation that Henry used, which is evidently aimed at charging. This is very important. Like, these were like battle lines of militas. They had lighter forces, together with them auxiliaries, mostly infantrymen, but this deployment is designed even to charge. So the point here was softening up some kind of initial Magyar force and then pouring in reserves until the entire enemy formation was broken. But we do not know who retreated when, if, for example, the Magyar heavies were into the fray. The bigger the engagement, as also here suggested by the greater amount of battle lines from the Saxon side, say the Eastern Frankish side, does suggest that the more like the more entire the commitment, the more intact like the spanning of all forces from both sides. So likely this was actually like a pretty interesting clash. Here the pursuit for 8 miles is sort of compatible with a pretty extensive battlefield. The Teutonians were wary, of course, of not pursuing the Magyars too much because they could have set up ambushes, and you do not really know out there what happens. In fact, normally these forces remained for 3 days on the battlefield. Normally they spent even the night after the victory freaking out because they were not sure that the entire enemy force had melted away. Unfortunately, again, this is all what Widukind says. So to complete it, let's pass to Liutprand's Antipodesis. Here it's book 1, chapter. I start from chapter 24. The battle specifically is at 31, but hey, it's interesting to read because it talks about some other political, strategical affairs. About the same time, the Hungarians heard of the death of King Conrad and the succession of Henry to the throne. They therefore held a conference and addressed to one another these arguments. It may be that a new king will wish to follow new laws. Let us therefore gather together a large force and go up and investigate the position and find out whether King Henry means to pay us the tribute that he owes us. If, as we do not believe, he is different from the other kings, let us lay his kingdom waste with an endless series of massacres and conflagrations. By the way, you immediately understand how sort of a more interesting civilized source, of course, from Lombardy, Liutprand of Cremona was. Now, we will not occupy the land of the Bavarians immediately. You see here how much interesting knowledge, by the way, from the Italic kingdom about German affairs. I mean, the guy would have been north of the Alps himself, but it's immediately something more articulate than Widukind. You immediately understand that. We will take the territory of the Saxons first, where Henry himself is king. Then if, as we do not expect, he should try to get an army together, it will not be able to reach him in time either from Lorraine or from France, or from Swabia or from Bavaria. Moreover, the land of the Saxons and the Thuringians can be easily ravaged, inasmuch as it has no mountain defenses nor any of the protection that fortified towns afford. This immediately, the intelligence of medieval authors, like this flashes you immediately a clearly strategic, operational, logistical picture of how even the Magyars would have reasoned when going at war with the Saxons, it's incredible. It's incredible. The difference between the various provinces, the fact that, the landscape is different, for the timing properly, like how much does it take for him to reach us, etc. This is literally what the Magyars would have reasoned like before launching their expedition. So you see that they're smart, right? They're depicted as smart enemy, which is even more menacing, more dangerous, of course, in a narrative as in reality. And it's interesting because, Henry, well, he may be like the other Eastern Frankish kings who will keep paying tribute. Instead, he may actually rise an army. And so in that case, we have to think how to behave. This is really, really cool. I will not name the chapters as long as we read them, because here we arrive already at the 25th, but I already gave them to you before. King Henry was laid up with a serious illness. When he was informed of the Hungarians' near approach, he scarcely waited for the report to end, but sent off messengers at once through Saxony, bidding every man who could come to him in 5 days under pain of death. Other very interesting information. We're talking about the size, in fact, of Saxony, something like between, some 100, say 5 days of march, we can argue 150 kilometers from where he was. Before the time had expired, a strong army had assembled, for it is the laudable and praiseworthy custom of the Saxons to allow no male above the age of 13 to shirk military service. This is also incredibly interesting. There would have been lots of this youth, aside from the fact that those were Thuringians in that aforementioned first rank, right? Because they're crazy, agile, fast, and so it's exactly what you need for this kind of task. They're also poorer, right? So those guys led by some other, grizzled veteran that knew how to do, even to make up for their weakness. Thereupon the king, weak in body but strong in spirit, found enough vigor to mount his horse, and collecting his forces round him, fired their fury for the fray by this address. And this is a beautiful passage of lyrics, essentially. Famous in war were the Saxons of old, lions in battle. By the way, yesterday we just talked about lion symbology in medieval heraldry. Their own they did hold, even when Charles the whole world has subdued, and every land with red carnage and brood. And that great victor the Saxons defeated, and if before his next rush they retreated, that was God's kindness who willed that our nation should have its share of the Christian salvation. Now the heathenish Turks who attack men who know nothing of Christ, and alack, hate God's own church, and would force us to pay money as ransom ere they march away. Up then, my heroes, and enter the fight. Show to the foe your invincible might. Pay them no tribute, but let the knaves know death is the gift they shall carry below. And when they're reckoning with you, they tell, count their doubloons in the red fires of hell. This is incredibly beautiful. There's a rejection of material, like I said, the lesser chthonic aspect, right? It's just like the Asgard of Saxony must be of pure gold, of pure, meant metaphorically in alchemy as properly pure spirit, against instead this murderers, this brigands that just want the dirt, basically, that they will find in hell when we will slaughter them. By the way, this is quite interesting. Of course, Liutprand writes in Latin, but you have to imagine these poems being composed in skaldic fashion at court, right? That these authors, these historians, would have been well versed with. There were songs about the battle, songs about the ancestors. It was all about this, and this was you understand here in the words, in the references. It's something inspiring. It's something cadence. It's something aimed at stirring, at exciting, right, for self-sacrifice in holy combat. The king seeing that his exhortations had, and by the way, it's the idea of the warrior bard, because here it's Henry that literally said this, allegedly. The king seeing that his exhortations had fired his men for the fray, called for silence, and once again, touched by the breath of divine inspiration, added these words, quote, "The deeds of the kings of old and the writings of the holy fathers suggest to us what we ought to do. It is not hard for God to defeat a great host with a small company if the fate of those who desire victory deserves it. A faith, I mean, not only of professions but of works, not only of the lips but of the heart. Let us pray then, and according to the psalmist, offer up our vows. I first, who seem to be foremost in rank and position, let the heresy of simony, hated by God and condemned by the blessed Peter, chief of the apostles, which up to now has been rashly maintained by my predecessors, be altogether banished from our realm. Love of unity will then bind together those whom the devil's cunning has separated." By the way, this is the same exact propaganda I was saying before, that of church reformation, that paradoxically would backfire against the empire, had been injected in Italy by the Ottonians to do things like, I don't know, installing Liutprand as a protege of Otto on a diocesan throne, that the Gregorians would use, in fact, to say nobody can touch the church. It's the church itself that elects the clergy, not the emperor. In any case, because Liutprand here was convinced, of course, as a Ghibelline, you could say, before time. Now, continuing, the king was desirous of saying more to the same effect when a flying messenger rushed in with news that the Hungarians were at Merseburg, a castle on the borders of the Saxons, Thuringians, and Slavonians. This sounds like Prince Eugen der Edle Ritter, almost, in the lyrics. So imagine this host that is threatened. I mean, they have the actual capacity to project themselves up to Saxony and demanding tribute. So it's pretty messed up. Like it's tough. Like this, the storm is condensing. And he added that they had taken a huge company of women and children prisoners and had killed an immense number of men. This is also very steppishly typical. In fact, Widukind says that there were lots of prisoners in the camp. Again, this sounds like what the Ottomans did in the same way we've seen of the siege of Vienna. So again, certain things never change. And for they had declared, in order to strike terror into the Saxons, that they would leave no one over 10 years of age alive. Consider, as we've seen, that also 13 years old had military training, so there is something like truly bloodily logical in this brutality, in these massacres. It's terrifying. The king's firm courage, however, was not dismayed, but he urged, I think it is a mistype, he urged his men all the more vehemently to battle, telling them it was their bounden duty to fight for their country and meet a glorious end. That's also very important. Not just defeating, but you have to fight and die if necessary. Meanwhile, the Hungarians were questioning their captives to find out if they were bound to attack. Being assured that otherwise their success was impossible, they sent out scouts to see if it was true. These men set out at once and came in sight of King Henry with a huge army close to the above-mentioned town of Merseburg. That's where, as we've seen, Liutprand locates the clash most. It may be an approximation just because Merseburg was so famous. Again, Merseburg and Magdeburg, this was the more important Ottonian sites in Liutprand's time. By the way, Liutprand would have been there, so it's not like he didn't know. It's just, I don't know, an Italian approximation of how they thought Germany was. I mean, Liutprand was very, very close to Otto the First. And again, there may be something propagandistic or symbolic about that because of the centrality of these ducal and, at this point, royal and imperial residences. But at large, they were truly the most important strongholds in Saxony. Which makes sense for the Magyars to have invaded, to have gone toward that direction to some degree. Right? So it's possible. Now, they scarcely had time to return to their men and tell them of the enemy's approach. Indeed, it was the king in person, not a messenger, who gave them warning of attack. The battle began immediately, right? So here, first of all, it's interesting what we're told that basically it's the Ottonians who have the initiative. The Magyars are taken at least by some sort of strategic surprise. This is, again, very important because something similar would happen at the Battle of Lechfeld. And again, it was an objective to try to gap as quickly as possible the distances between these raiding parties and the bulk of the Magyar forces to get rid of them once for all. Otherwise, they would have simply withdrawn and not suffered a devastating defeat. Here instead, Liutprand literally stresses this. So this shows how powerful Henry's strategic mind really was, if he really succeeded in this way, as the outcome of the battle suggests. So he manages to catch the enemy by surprise. That's also perhaps why, if what Widukind says is true regarding the Thuringian lighter line, this immediacy of the attack combined with, oh my god, they caught us by surprise, but we kind of broke their line, may be even more powerful in terms of making the Magyars lose their order and discipline and simply pursue the enemy because they are nervous. They want to get it over with quickly because they're freaking out, right? So it actually makes a lot of sense, as twisted as it is, to combine the two sources that, as we've seen, do understand war. From the Christians' ranks on all sides was heard the holy and wondrous cry, Kyrie eleison. So this is very interesting as well, because we tend to forget it, but battles were not just very visual, but also very auditory experiences. We've seen there before the banner of the Holy Ghost of Victoria. Here you have the Kyrie eleison, so Lord have mercy upon us. You can imagine warriors communicating themselves before the battle. There were lots of very interesting things going on. Here we do not have any additional info, but we can imagine what would happen even the day before battle. We can imagine, again, the ambiguity, like the very thin thread that these armies lingered on, like regarding the awareness, again, of each other and the ultimate situation here. It's all, again, fascinating because you see throughout old Middle European military history this idea of the West, say of the Germans, and then these other peoples from the steppes, or the Turks, the Ottomans, having very similar behaviors in all of this. Think about how at the siege of Vienna, the Allied Christian army immediately arrived, like catching the Ottomans by surprise. That was a very different context, a massive siege in which the Ottomans had entrenched themselves to the point of neglecting an open field confrontation. This was likely different, but they were surely gravitating around some kind of siege, because that's how they would regularly proceed, also just to lure the enemy. Because, I mean, it's the Magyars that have the strategic, at large in the campaign, the strategic initiative. They are the ones who have arrived in Saxony. So here now, again, the Saxons may counterattack in a way that catches them by surprise strategically. But still, like, it's because the Magyars are there to fight in open field against the Saxons. I mean, the fact that, as we've seen, the Magyars would normally try to maintain the distances from the enemies. It's true only when they don't have to actually go at full battle with them. It's just like with the Mongols, with the Ottomans. You may refuse the center. You have always this kind of step tactics involved, differently calibrated. But against the Westerners, it's basically always the same, but it's still an open field confrontation. That's the thing you do if you are strong, if you are going there because you want to smash your enemy. And this is what the Magyars are also there for. So, of course, the local circumstances may change depending on how the campaign go. But at large, here before the major clash the strategic forces would have been intact and of the same scale, so perfectly to meet in that kind of clash. And here it's also interesting, Lord have mercy on us, from the Christian side and from the heathen, Luthbrand says, came the foul and diabolical shout, "Ui, ui," which is actually that kind of howling sound that, as we've seen, both the Saxons and the Slavs had mocked the Magyars for, giving them a dead dog as an answer, the equivalent of nuts, right? Except here it's really insulting their own the savage sort of steppe wolf howling practice that they had. We will talk about battle cries in some other video, but it's important to stress how cultural differences play a role in war, and how it's from this misunderstanding that also military mistakes can be done. At large, this is what war is about. So before the beginning of so this is finally chapter 31. Before the beginning of the engagement, Henry had given his men this sagacious and practical advice. This is very interesting, very famous in high medieval literature. Quote, "When you are hastening forward to the first skirmish, let no one of you try to get ahead of his comrades just because he has a swifter horse. Cover yourselves on one side with your bucklers and catch the first flight of arrows on your shields. Then rush at them at full speed as furiously as you can, so that before they have time to fire a second volley, they may feel the blows of your swords upon their heads." All right. So this is a bit, oversimplified, but the point is sound. I mean, of course, and this is a point we made ourselves very often, like this notion that the horse archer is impregnable, uncatchable, you can't do anything about it, especially with a heavier mount, etc., is BS, all right? Western cavalry always could everywhere. If you look at the Levantine Crusades, if you look at the Reconquista, if you look at the ancient world as well, look at Celtiberian cavalry against the Numidian one, the lighter guy can always be chased. And here it's not even just about being chased, because one thing is chasing 1-to-1. All right, and then it's easier actually for the guy getting away. But if, as we said before, and like here it's suggested, the enemy has a battle line himself, and it's mostly and loosely composed by these horse archers, it's not like these horse archers have, because of their order, the immediate capacity of simply getting out of the way and or simply running away wherever. Right, as we said before, we do not know much about the battlefield or whatever, but again, you must run into something. If you are deployed in depth in the same way, there is a battle line behind. If it's true that horse archers can sort of fluidify and sort of escape, like behind, even passing through the gaps of the units, because they are breaking their own formation in open order, right? But that's normally also when they're spent and they're not to fight again, or maybe forming a sort of scrap, like emergency reserve at the bottom of the line, but we never heard of this actually working that much. This is what, for example, the Hungarians do at the Battle of Markfeld, right? They actually defeat the Bohemian Moravian battle line. They spanned it, they tempested with archers, sorry, because these were Cumans largely, not even Hungarians. And then they literally passed by the entire enemy army and they went plundering their own camp behind them. So they are that flexible, but only when, again, they are, like, if they are just there to run away, what are they for, really? When you have, for example, even a battle line, like in this case, constituted mostly by horse archers, it's not like they're there just to run away if you chase them. All right, they constitute a mass. They do have that cohesion that you must break at some point. And paradoxically, it's easier in this sense to cause disorder among these by charging in them, even if they individually could run away, because as packed as they are, they're somehow easier to slaughter. Now, the hope is what from the Magyar side? The hope is that the enemy, in order to maintain cohesion of their cavalry, will advance slowly, as it was usually done, because literally most advances happen at pace, along the field. And of course, here you could get in the range of the Magyar bows in hundreds of meters away, and then you would have to, at that point, to be exposed to the hails of arrows and increase the advance. And here, cavalry is very good from the Saxon side. Otherwise, Henry would have not given this advice to begin with. And these are essentially, in a military sense, paradoxically, the sons of the Carolingians, right? This is how the Westerns fight now. And since the Strategicon, we've seen that they had actually the best cavalry chargers in many ways. But, of course, there is some difficulty, especially with some larger forces that are to simply maintain cohesion under fire. And essentially being swift enough, but without increasing disorder during the advance. Here, Henry by Luthbrand bypasses the thing by essentially stating, just go fast enough to bridge the gap, to close with the enemy without taking too many arrows in process. But you would tendentially lose cohesion. So here, again, what Luthbrand implies in a logical sense is that at least this cavalry was good enough to do so, right? And in fact, he literally actually tells, like, if you have a swifter horse, do not go ahead. Like, do not come out of the formation. That was the task of the Rottmeister, always to ride before the lines to check if everybody was aligned, and shouting at the guys we would break, because cohesion in cavalry charge is way more important than speed, right? You don't even charge at full gallop. It's risky. That's what happened at the Battle of Zumthal, right? Fresh levies from the Rhineland put together just like in the moment. They were nervous. They charged at full gallop. They broke the cohesion of the formation. The Saxon infantry got them, right? That's what happens when you lose control. And if anything, the only thing I believe reenactment is useful for is that every idiot can throw himself against an enemy and getting killed. There is literally nothing special about it. Holding, to maintain cohesion, to properly field it muscle to muscle in terms of respective units confronting one another, is the whole thing that this battle line logic and the art of war is based on, right? So here, the advice, if anything, is more protective. It says, use the shield to parry, like the first volley. And so here, allegedly, the Magyars would have thrown just the first volley before the enemy could cover the range of the same shot before another was thrown. This is probably just to give an idea of what this was. It was close in, because don't let yourself being exposed enough, and just let's show them that you can maintain cohesion even when we sort of accelerate. So do not break the formation, respect the order, discipline. This is very hard. This is very hard to do. And it's great that in 10th century Germany, you see already this level of cavalry development that essentially before the Carolingian conquest was not really nor professional, nor in fact numerous enough in particular to provide with this kind of performance against Saxon armies with largely infantrymen, as we've seen for Zumthal as well, right? So this is a beautiful, beautiful advice. And of course says, close in, cut them to pieces, which is, of course, also what you would expect. So Luthbrand continues, says, the Saxons accordingly, remembering this practical advice, advance in level lines of maintaining order. No one used his horse's speed to get in front of his slower neighbor. Remember, these Saxons were just recently disciplined. All right, it's a bit like, the Roman legion. There was this Italic warlike individualism behind it, is channeled by brutal discipline imposed by the Romans that still lives in the legionnaire, right? And and that yet is unleashed, and that's combination we're talking about before in Civilization. Here is the same with the Saxons, right? These Saxon horsemen would have not been able to perform this if their ancestors had not been beaten as brutally as you can imagine by the Carolingians, that literally didn't give a damn about any trace of value of human life. When they took the field against the enemy, whoever you had in front, you cut to pieces, all right? This is the outcome of this. This is the lesson learned. And the Saxons here have kind of the first useful chance to prove it at an international level, because a kind of confrontation like this had not really ever happened before. So no one used, we read this, or counter shield, and they kept, and the king bade them, they caught the enemies, right? It says, but covering themselves on one side with their shields, as we've seen. So it's a sort of mounted shield wall, right? And remember always, the shield wall has practically no offensive capacity whatsoever, just an anti-projectile thing. But here, the cohesion is used also to maintain this closeness of the ranks that is kind of implied here, because if you want to protect yourself, it's also the horse. And so the more compact cavalry is, sort of the more qualitative it is. There are beautiful passages from later chivalric literature that, as you know, said that even if you had thrown an apple into these guys, it would have not fallen, because we're so knee to knee, almost shoulder to shoulder, that were so beautifully ordered that you couldn't have it, nothing could have fallen in between. Here it's kind of the same, right? You exploit this proximity to maybe not interlock the shields, of course, but to something approximate to that, so that the horsemen would be enough protected. This tells you, by the way, because we are in the 10th century in Saxony, in Thuringia, even, say, the heavily armored guys are a few, relatively a few. So there would have been lots of lighter horsemen, a bit like the ones we've seen in the first line, the one that sacrifices itself. Similar sacrifices we've seen, by the way, at the Battle of Tagliacozzo, for example, the Marshal Charles of Anjou. Right, so these things were done in this de facto now fully chivalric culture, at least more primitively to the one of the later centuries, but still here, you understand, it's a cavalry confrontation, right? We talked about Liutprand. I made a video about the 11th century Milanese army that is just 1 century after this time, and Liutprand, we made the point that Liutprand does practically never talk about infantry, whereas in the 11th century, say, those infantries in Lombardy had gained importance. And Liutprand does this also for the Saxon army, that likely, also considering other political reasons of how these armies were levied across such a wide territory, that it's not like the Saxons really fully controlled at large, but tended to be more mounted for also practical, operational, say, logistical reasons, supplying systems and so on, would have been, in fact, a bit more contemptuous toward infantry. Germany, again, was brutally accelerating towards a vassalic beneficiary system where infantrymen were preferred to be working at home as somebody else's people, as peasants, to, in fact, supply their lords on horseback, right, to produce what was necessary for the forage, producing arms and armor and so on. This is similar, and we see, in fact, how brutally advanced actually this Saxon equestrian culture really is, because we tend to underestimate that, right? There are peoples, especially the northern Germans, also the Western Slavs, that, especially at this point, do not seem to have made an overwhelming use of cavalry, of course. But aside from the fact that the Poles, this is typical, at least of the Slavs, they had lighter horsemen, so tendentially they had a bit more of them compared to the Westerns. But the Westerners also had pretty heavy one, so they were still kind of elite. And as such, they reached these levels of performance. Of course, again, there were also lots of non-elite cavalrymen also among the Westerners, but these were all being functionalized to support those elite troops. We'll see this better because, again, Saxon warfare at this point is very interesting. We should talk about medieval Saxony much more. So going on, then according to their wise leader's command, they rushed at full speed upon the foe, who groaned and gave up the ghost before they could shoot again. It's very interesting. It's interesting how Liutprand visualizes it. So by the kindness of God's grace, the Holy Ghost, and so what was used, as we've seen from in Widukind, as the banner of this, let's say, it imperial army at the end of the day, the Hungarian found flight preferable to battle. Their swiftest horses then seemed sluggish to them. Their gorgeous trappings and bright shields appeared a burden rather than a protection. They threw aside their bows, flung away their arrows, tore off their horses' trappings that nothing might check their speed, and thought of nothing but precipitate flight. This is, of course, very interesting as well, as we see that the Magyars were not savages here. Again, Liutprand describes them as, because they were, of course, more primitive than the Westerners, but they were rich. They had been enriching themselves with all this looting across Europe. They were an importantly developed military culture. We know that the Magyars had passed through their westward steppe journey very close to the Caucasus. They had remained very heavily influenced by Persian military culture, especially in Poliorcetics. They would maintain a connection with the Middle East also through the eastern branches of the Silk Route, passing to essentially up to the Carpathians. So they were not. They were, again, a rude, wild, sort of brute and a rough force in many ways. But they were fairly advanced, right, and developed by steppe standards. So also the steppes grow over time, and these are not fully, howling animals from Central Asia, right, that also had actually pretty good horsemen in the elite. These are something already a bit more also participant in that counter-culture, like how many Slavs, as we've seen, were present in these armies, but there were even Vikings sometimes in these Magyar forces. So that's all a story we have to explain better. But yeah, at large, here it's beautiful how it says, the swiftest horses then seemed sluggish to them. This is beautiful because Liutprand nails the fact that you can have the best means, but when heart falters, when here it says they gave up the ghost before they could shoot again, everything bogs down. You're crippled, you're frozen, you're terrorized. This is the moment in which the darkest forces emerge within you and you are freaking out, and only the guys who have the toughest control themselves can do anything about this. And this force is lost, basically, dissolved in this attack. So they threw aside their bows, flung away their arrows, tore off their horses' trappings, did nothing. I've already said this. But Almighty God, who had stripped them of courage for the fray, denied them any chance of escape. The Hungarians accordingly were cut to pieces. This differs from Widukind, that says that a few had been killed. Maybe again to recount the Lech more clamorously, that was the point, and put to flight the great throng of their prisoners was released, and the voice of lamentation changed to songs of joy. It seems like the liberation of the Ottoman camp after Vienna 1683. This memorable and glorious triumph the king had celebrated in the upper room of a house at Merseburg, par un tableau, that is, by a picture, so that you can now see the battle, not as it may have happened, but as it actually occurred. This is also incredibly interesting from a historical point of view. They had literal pictures of how the battle went, and you could see it publicly displayed in these halls where the warriors also could romanticize and their nostalgia about the clash, because these were immense chances, as we've seen, of distinction. Most people would have liked to die actually in a clash like this than in this many smaller ones that nobody would remember. The Holy Ghost had manifested, as we've seen. There was all an epos developing from this. So this was such a great deal, right? And here, like, it passes to Italian politics. So this is all there was to get, right? So I think this is quite beautiful. Again, we don't know practically anything about the numbers, the figures. I said before that we can think of them to be in the tens of thousands. Sometimes you find strangely in certain resumes, like, I don't know, the losses were reportedly minor from both sides. Why? You know, if this was a big battle, and normally I studied them, what kind of big battle escalates into a clash and only few people died? Like, there are things like this when, especially like very elite forces confront against one another, but at large, right? How would you imagine? It's true, Widukind says the Magyars get out of the way, but what about Luthbrand? I mean, this is a draw, right? So if it is a draw, how likely it is in a large confrontation that actually the defeated side is broken and they flee, and there is not much that can be done in the process. So I would opt towards that. Again, since we don't have the numbers, I wouldn't basically say anything if not, but maybe there were thousands of dead from the Magyar side, maybe contained. Just if we were talking a force of 20,000, say, or maybe less, you say 1,000 dead is okay, like 2,000. It's like the entire army is not literally destroyed, but let's say its cohesion, its spirit, its organizational compaction, it's over, right? And in fact, like, Magyar raids would actually continue, so this was not like a total victory, everything ends. Really, the Lech stops that. But without Riade, probably the Lech would have not been, even with the same outcome, so resolutive in terms of the Magyar raids into Western Europe. So here, again, this is such an important figure. This is such an important event for Henry, right? This brought troops reportedly to hail him as the symbolic boost to his kingship. It was truly understood in an imperial sense because of the traditional meaning of the imperium. Politically, Riade cemented Henry's authority, proving he could protect the realm and rally its dukes while ending the tribute-drained Magyar leverage. Strategically, it showcased his reformed army's ability to counter nomadic tactics, deterring major raids during his lifetime, because this was not over, in fact, but not even in terms of Saxon victories. A Magyar incursion in 938 was quickly repelled, and only in 954 did they seriously threaten again. The decisive blow came under, as we were saying before, Henry's son, Otto I, at the Battle of Blackfoot on August 10th, 955, ending the Magyar menace for good, at least in the aforementioned form. Then wars between the Germans, the Hungarians, even the possibility of making Hungary, as later Bohemia, part of the Holy Roman Empire, as Poland, by the way, was open still until the 11th, even the 12th century. That's a very interesting chapter we should really open on Schwerpunkt, because it's so underrated, it's almost criminal. Otto per Thietmar of Merseburg is another very important source of the period, vowed before Lechfeld to dedicate a bishopric to St. Lawrence in Merseburg if victorious, a pledge tied to Riade's legacy in that region. Riade thus marked a turning point, a rejection of appeasement, a test of Henry the Fowler's military overhaul, and a foundation for East France's emergence as a stronger, more unified power under the Ottonian dynasty. It's a pleasure, of course, to make videos like these, in the sense that they are easier to make than I have something, for example, incoming from. We will arrive to April for that. I will not say it's the Battle of the Crusades, that it's even just literally from the century afterwards, but has so many resources more to describe it. And so that makes you see in perspective so much about cultures, about peoples. I personally would like to talk more and more about this Ottonian period that, as I was saying at the beginning of the video, is sometimes oddly overlooked. Again, I don't understand why, because it seems like a cornerstone for most high medieval, especially Central, but in general Western, Southern European history, that I don't think can be questioned. Here I have made 20 videos about Ottonian Germany, right? So we're getting somewhere, right, where we should be. There is enough here. But I don't see too many views here of the playlist per se. Well, okay, it doesn't matter. About the Ottonians specifically, we made 17 videos. This is the 18th. And what can I say? For example, the Ottonians. How many views does this playlist have? Probably not many. 487. It should be more. Yeah, it's such an important topic. Nobody really talks about it as they should. For the rest, this is a battle video, as you understand. There is a series. Well, Ottonian Germany, 484. Yeah, they tend to watch maybe. Okay, I'm just reforming a bit also the playlist descriptions with AI-generated tags, because they easily fill all the 600 playlists that I have, and they're very useful. I suspect that this is connected even with the recent surge in views, by the way. And I'm glad, again, that this content can be publicized in such fashion. You've seen as a battle how, again, simple. This is, you don't have to reconstruct almost anything, but if you read carefully, you understand so much from this. You've seen how many traditional hints, even in a relatively short text, we have managed to find. We found even significant tactical information. This is literally the thing about the lighter troops in the front of the Saxon host. It's basically everything we know in some level of tactical detail, right? They open probably, again, to a much greater complexity of the battle that we can't see. Yes, it's 10th century Germany, so from both sides you can't expect this overwhelming complexity. As you could see, even, a century later, just making the comparison there with, the Crusades battles, for example. However, it's not like that we have to think this was, just a brawl. Absolutely not. This was a large engagement. It was really relevant as far as an entire regional balance was shattered practically. And as a whole, it's pretty obvious that we can't dig behind that. That thing of, for example, the shield wall on horseback is very often cited. At least I participated to circles where we talk about this stuff in some relatively serious way at the time. Of course, I especially took off. Is really a great proof of a greatly developed equestrian culture at large, right? The notion that these forces, for example, were again the development of knighthood, right? And so that but cavalry was not so developed after all in continental Europe since ancient times. Really, of course, Germany was sort of more fringe in this. It was the least developed of the post-Carolingian kingdoms, and it's paradoxical that effectively it came to be the leader of the empire again. But it's in fact also proof of how not so distant the various parts of the continent really were. But there is a tradition that allows for the development of a sound equestrian culture that simply grows together with the development of society, and with some here mostly elite aristocratic leadership that tends also to sever out a bit, as we've seen the infantry, the common folks. There had been the Stellinger revolt in the previous century. Lots of things had been engineered in Germany, socially speaking, for which the establishment was really changing. And this is in a sense the product, and it is amazing. It's from even these accounts that you can sense so much about that balance, about that really that almost quantitative dimension that you don't have here by any explicit indicator, but you can explicit counter at least, but that you can grasp from these indications, from these hints. This is incredibly important, in my view. So that, again, we'll continue talking about Ottonian warfare. I'm really glad that we got to this point here, talking about Riade. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.